Hello everyone. Today we will delve into a true story, a gruesome case that once shocked the entire United States. This story is not only a warning about mysterious disappearances and barbaric crimes, but also a reflection of society's indifference and apathy. The setting of our story is not a sprawling, glittering metropolis or a peaceful small town, but an ancient port city along a great river in the American Midwest. Here, old brick houses, mossy streets, and a bustling port have become witnesses to a haunting tale, a case that once stirred public opinion and gave many people pause for thought. This city, with its simple, generous people, seemed to be always filled with peace. The lives of the residents in the small alleys and old apartment buildings passed by simply, connected to breezy afternoons by the port, corner bars, and stories of neighborly love. It seemed as though this tranquility would never be broken, yet an invisible sense of unease gradually enveloped the city as mysterious disappearances began to occur. The first incident was recorded almost a year ago. The victim was Frank Miller, a man in his 50s, known as a notorious drunkard throughout the city. Frank was a dock worker who lived on a meager wage. He spent whatever money he earned on alcohol, often getting drunk and verbally abusing his wife and children. One afternoon, Frank told his wife he was going to the corner bar for a few drinks with friends and would be back. But he vanished without a trace. His family searched everywhere but couldn't find him. The local police department received the report but could only log it in their records. A few weeks later, the neighborhood was once again in an uproar over the disappearance of Maria Santes, a widowed woman in her 40s who lived alone in a small house on the street. Maria was a kind woman who only knew how to work to raise her child. When her grown son, who was working far away, couldn't reach her by phone and asked a neighbor to check on her, they found the door still locked from the inside, but no one answered. When the police and family members broke in, there were no signs of disturbance, no traces of a struggle or theft, only the person was gone as if they had evaporated into thin air. Like this, a person disappeared every 2 or 3 weeks. The next victim was John Hayes, another man also known for his heavy drinking. Then came Eleanor Vance, another solitary widow. The disappearances continued erratically, with no clear temporal pattern. But gradually, a terrifying commonality emerged. All the missing men were heavy drinkers who lived dissolute lives. As for the women, they were all widows who lived alone with few relatives. They were people on the fringes of the community. Their disappearance, while initially causing a stir, was quickly faded into the daily struggle for survival. The predator had targeted the vulnerable, people whose absence might not be noticed urgently, a cold-blooded tactic to exploit society's indifference. The number of missing persons reports at the local police department began to increase abnormally. Initially, the investigators considered these to be isolated civil cases, but when the number reached more than 10 people in less than a year, Lieutenant Ryan Peterson, the head of the police department's criminal investigation unit, felt that something was very wrong. He was a young, well-trained officer with a sharp analytical mind. He didn't believe in random coincidences, especially in the field of crime. He ordered his subordinates to compile all missing persons case files in the city from the past 2 years. In the criminal unit's office, Lieutenant Peterson sat silently in front of a large map of the city. On that map, he used different colored pens to mark the locations of the missing people's homes. Red for the alcoholic men, blue for the widowed women. When all 12 pens were placed, a terrifying pattern was revealed. All the victims lived concentrated in a few adjacent neighborhoods along the Great River. They didn't disappear far away. They vanished right where they had lived their entire lives. This is not a coincidence. Lieutenant Peterson said to his colleagues in an emergency meeting, his voice full of conviction. 12 people disappearing in a small geographical area with very specific personal characteristics. People who are marginalized, vulnerable, and less cared for by society. It's very possible we are dealing with a predator, a serial killer. This realization stunned the entire investigation team. The concept of a serial killer was something usually only seen in movies or in cases abroad, but what was happening in this port city suggested it was a very real possibility. Some invisible devil was lurking in the community, quietly selecting and taking its prey. The link between personal characteristics and geographical location indicated that this was an organized and planned criminal, someone who had leveraged the very invisibility of the victims to carry out their crimes. Immediately, Lieutenant Peterson reported all his findings and observations to the police chief. Recognizing the particularly serious nature of the case, the chief decided to form a special task force, a special homicide task force, with Lieutenant Peterson as its standing deputy. With the support of the city police department's most elite detectives, the task force's mission was to uncover the truth behind this string of mysterious disappearances before another victim was claimed. The investigation was relaunched from the beginning, but with an entirely new perspective. The victims were no longer considered missing persons, but potential victims of a murder case. The detectives were divided into multiple teams, re-examining each case one by one. They went back to meet with the victims' families, but this time they didn't just ask about their whereabouts, but also about their relationships and even the smallest conflicts. They meticulously reconstructed the psychological profiles and daily habits of each person. For the alcoholic men, they often disappeared in the evening after leaving cheap bars. For the widowed women, they often disappeared at night right from their own homes. It seemed the perpetrator knew very well the routines and vulnerabilities of each victim. He acted with incredible swiftness, leaving no trace at the scene, such as a disturbance, struggle, or theft of property. This suggested that the killer's motive might not be money. Weeks passed, and the investigation was at a standstill. The perpetrator was like a ghost, leaving no trace. The task force felt like they were fumbling in a dark tunnel with no way out. Public anxiety grew, putting heavy pressure on the police officers. Just as the investigation was reaching a dead end, a first lead, an unexpected direction, emerged from the testimony of the son of victim John Hayes, one of the alcoholic victims. In a follow-up interview, after persistent questioning by the investigators, the son recalled a detail. That day, about 3 days before my dad disappeared, he came home from drinking and didn't have money to pay, so he had a huge argument with Mikey the Scar Rizzo at the corner cafe. That Mikey, he runs underground gambling there. My dad lost a lot and owed him a significant amount. That day, he accused him of cheating, and Mikey got angry and pointed right at my dad's face and threatened him, "You better watch it. If you can't pay, don't blame me if this river gets cold." The name Mikey the Scar Rizzo and the detail about the illegal gambling done immediately caught the attention of the task force. Mikey Rizzo was no stranger to the city police. He had a few priors for disorderly conduct and gambling, a known local tough guy. The fact that a debtor suddenly disappeared after arguing and being threatened by his creditor was extremely suspicious. Could Mikey Rizzo have killed Hayes to settle the debt and send a message to other debtors? And if he could do that to one person, could he have done the same to others, especially those alcoholics who also frequented his gambling den? A new hypothesis was formed. Perhaps this was not a series of murders committed by a deranged psychopath, but a string of hits over gambling disputes carried out by a criminal organization. This theory seemed logical and less gruesome. Lieutenant Peterson immediately directed a team of detectives to focus on Mikey Rizzo. He knew that whether or not he was the perpetrator of the entire crime spree, shutting down such a gambling operation was a necessary mission to clean up the area. In the task force meeting room, the first name was written on the whiteboard: Suspect 1, Mikey the Scar Rizzo, gambling dispute. Focus on this subject, Lieutenant Peterson pointed to the name. Secretly monitor all activities of the gambling den. I want to know if this guy Mikey Rizzo is involved in the disappearance of Hayes and possibly others. The investigation finally had a specific target to pursue. The investigators had no idea that they had just begun to step into a complex maze, and that Mikey Rizzo was only one of the ghosts they would have to face on their path to finding the truth. Lieutenant Ryan Peterson's order officially pointed the investigation spearhead at the first suspect, Mikey the Scar Rizzo, a menacing nickname, much like the long scar that ran diagonally across his left eye, a relic from street brawls in his youth. Focusing on Rizzo brought the task force a temporary sense of relief. They no longer had to deal with an invisible ghost, but a specific subject with a known background, criminal record, and most importantly, a clear motive for murder. The process of gathering information on Rizzo was carried out urgently, but also very secretly. Experienced detectives were deployed, lingering in cafes and gathering spots for criminals to get a feel for the situation. A detailed portrait of Rizzo gradually emerged. At 39 years old, he was a well-known figure in the city. Under the guise of a normal-looking garden cafe, he operated a large-scale gambling den and loan sharking network, attracting many local gamblers, especially laborers and penniless alcoholics. Rizzo's file was thick with priors for disorderly conduct, intentional assault, and organizing gambling. His underlings were also reckless individuals, willing to use violence to resolve any issue. The detectives managed to contact a few of Rizzo's former debtors. They recounted in fear that he had extremely brutal methods of debt collection, from sending people to threaten and smash property to kidnapping and brutally beating people. The information gathered all confirmed that around the time of his disappearance, victim John Hayes did owe Rizzo a large sum of money. Hayes had not only lost at gambling, but also dared to spread rumors everywhere that Rizzo was cheating, which affected the reputation of the gambling den. For a gangster who valued his reputation like Rizzo, this was an unacceptable insult. Rizzo's motive for murder, to both settle the debt, silence him, and send a message to others, was entirely plausible. With this information, Lieutenant Peterson decided it was time to confront him directly. A summons was sent to Rizzo's house. He appeared at the city police headquarters with an extremely arrogant attitude. He was accompanied by an underling. Both were dressed in expensive clothes and reeked of cologne. Rizzo walked into the interrogation room, plopped down in a chair, and put his feet on the table as if it were his own home. The long scar on his face wrinkled, making his expression even more menacing. "What's so urgent, officers, that you had to call me in?" he asked, his voice disdainful. Lieutenant Peterson sat opposite him, his face silent and calm, a calm full of pressure. He pushed a photo of the victim, John Hayes, toward Rizzo. "Do you know this person?" Rizzo glanced at the photo and smirked. "Ah, Wino John, of course I know him, one of my most stubborn debtors. I heard he ran off to avoid his debts. Why do you have his photo here today?" He feigned innocence. "He didn't run off. He died, along with others. We suspect this is a serial murder case." Lieutenant Peterson stared at Rizzo, not missing a single expression. Hearing the words serial murder, the smile on Rizzo's face stiffened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "That sounds serious. Serial murder? Like in the movies. You should go find the killer then. Why call me in?" "How much money did Hayes owe you?" "A few $1,000s, but he's dead now, so what's the point? I guess I'm out of luck." "We've been told that before he disappeared, Hayes had a big argument with you, and you threatened to show him how this river gets cold. How do you explain that?" Rizzo shrugged. "In business, you have to have a few words, officer. He owed me money and wouldn't pay.
And he was also slandering me. I got angry and threatened him a little. That's normal in my line of work. It was just a threat to scare him to pay his debt. I didn't do anything to him. I only need the money, not the life of a drunk. If he's dead, I lose money, so what do I gain? He answered smoothly. The logic of a gangster seemed very plausible. But Rizzo knew that wily individuals like Rizzo always had 100 excuses to justify themselves. So on the nights when the other victims disappeared, like the night of Frank Miller or Maria Sanchez, where were you and what were you doing? Rizzo pretended to try to remember. Good heavens, that was a year ago. How am I supposed to remember? Maybe I was home sleeping. Maybe I was out drinking with my guys. It's been too long. It was an answer that couldn't be more vague. No alibi, uncooperative attitude, a clear motive. All suspicion was piling up against Rizzo. The interrogation lasted for hours, but the gangster was extremely stubborn, not revealing a single word of value. In the end, without enough evidence to hold him, Lieutenant Peterson had no choice but to let him go. But a 24/7 surveillance order on Rizzo and his underlings was secretly put in place. The investigation into Rizzo seemed to have reached a dead end. He wouldn't confess, and the investigators couldn't find any other leads. But Lieutenant Peterson didn't give up. He believed that a gangster like Rizzo, no matter how cunning, would leave a trace. He ordered the detectives to re-examine all the old files, searching again for all of Rizzo's relations and trusted underlings from a year ago. Many of them were now in prison or had moved elsewhere. The search was extremely difficult, and after nearly a week of tireless review, a ray of light appeared. The detectives located a man named Jimmy the Waste, who had once been a very close underling of Rizzo's, but had now washed his hands and moved back to his hometown to open a small auto repair shop. At first, Jimmy the Waste was terrified and refused to cooperate. He was afraid of retaliation from Rizzo. But after persistent persuasion and safety assurances from the investigators, he finally agreed to provide a crucial piece of information. Jimmy the Waste confirmed that on the night of John Hayes disappeared, Rizzo was not in the port city at all. He remembered it very clearly because it was a big event. Jimmy recounted that on that very day, Rizzo had taken nearly 20 of his most trusted underlings, including himself, and traveled by car to another city a few hundred miles away to resolve a major business dispute with a rival gang there. The two gangs even had a large brawl in a bar that night, and some of them were arrested by local police.
This information hit the task force like a bucket of cold water. Lieutenant Peterson immediately verified it. An urgent dispatch was sent to the other city's police department, and within a few hours, the answer came back. The police records confirmed that on that very night, a large-scale brawl had occurred at a bar. In the list of people who were held for administrative investigation that night was the name Mikey Rizzo. The alibi was too clear and irrefutable. Mikey Rizzo was not the killer. He might be a loan shark, a criminal, but in this murder case, he was completely innocent. The first lead had officially reached a dead end after all the hard work and effort of the entire team. In the city police's meeting room, the atmosphere became heavy. Lieutenant Peterson walked to the whiteboard and drew a long diagonal line through the name Mikey Rizzo. Disappointment was visible on the faces of the young officers. "We've eliminated a wrong direction," Lieutenant Peterson said, his voice still full of determination. "That's also a success. It brings us closer to the truth. The killer is not a gangster settling gambling disputes. He is someone else, someone with a motive that we cannot yet explain." He ordered his subordinates to go back to the beginning, once again meticulously reviewing each victim's file, meeting with each relative, and not missing a single detail, no matter how small. 2 days later, a young detective returned from a follow-up interview with the family of one of the most recent victims, Mr. Dave Thompson, an alcoholic man. "Report, Lieutenant," the detective said, his voice a little excited.
This detail was overlooked by the family before because they didn't think it was important. Mr. Thompson's wife just remembered that on the night her husband disappeared, he was sitting on the porch mumbling to himself when a strange man in a pickup truck stopped by. This man said he had a bunch of delicious eels at his eel farm and invited her husband to go there for a few more drinks. Her husband, hearing there was alcohol, went with him right away. She didn't know this man, only heard her husband vaguely call him River Eel Cal, the owner of a very large and isolated eel farm on the other side of the river. The name River Eel Cal and the detail about the isolated eel farm immediately electrified the entire meeting room. This was the first time in the series of disappearances that a specific individual was directly linked to a victim right before they vanished. A mysterious man living in isolation with a habit of inviting alcoholics to his home. All these characteristics were highly suspicious. Lieutenant Peterson quickly walked to the board. He erased all the old theories. He wrote a new name, a name still full of mystery. River Eel Cal, the eel farm. "Concentrate all our forces," he ordered, his voice echoing with power. "Verify this man immediately. I want to know who this guy Cal is and what horrifying secret his eel farm is hiding." The name River Eel Cal and the information about the isolated eel farm became the focus of the entire task force. For the first time after nearly a year of futile investigation, they had a concrete lead, a suspect to focus on. However, every action from this point on had to be carried out with extreme caution. The suspect lived alone, in isolation, and had suspicious behaviors that suggested he was a very cunning and dangerous individual. One wrong move could spook the beast, causing it to erase all traces and disappear deeper into the shadows. The first task for the detectives was to build a profile of this mysterious man. By working with the police and local authorities where Cal was registered, the task force quickly obtained basic information. His real name was Calvin Fisher, 52, originally from another state. He was not a local. About 6 years ago, he came here and used cash to buy a vast swampy plot of land nearly 10 acres along the river, a remote, sparsely populated area. Then he hired machinery to convert the land into a large-scale eel farm by himself. Calvin Fisher's record was quite clean. He had no prior arrests or criminal history. But when detectives began to secretly gather information from residents living in the adjacent area, a picture of an eccentric and reclusive person gradually emerged. The residents said that River Eel Cal was an extremely private person. He hardly socialized with anyone. He lived alone in a makeshift house built right in the middle of the farm, managing all the work himself. This was very unusual because caring for dozens of tons of eels required a lot of labor. This suggested that Cal had extraordinary strength and, most importantly, did not want any strangers near his property. Occasionally, people saw him crossing the river in an old pickup truck to go to the market. He didn't linger at shops, only buying what was necessary: a large quantity of cheap alcohol, a few bags of pig feed, medicine, and other essentials. He always paid with cash, rarely spoke, and his eyes always scrutinized others with a cold, suspicious gaze. With this initial information, Lieutenant Ryan Peterson had even more reason to believe that Calvin Fisher was a person with many hidden secrets, and a plan for a secret surveillance of his entire farm was laid out. This was an extremely difficult task. His farm was in an overly isolated location. It was bordered by the main river in front and by dense water forests and swamps on the back and sides, with almost no road access. The task force decided to use 2 surveillance teams simultaneously. The first team, made up of experienced river detectives, would pose as fishermen. Every day they would use a small boat to cast nets on the river, slowly drifting past Cal's farm. From a safe distance, they would use high-resolution recording devices to observe all activities on the riverbank of the farm. The second team, more challenging, was tasked with approaching from the land. It took a team of detectives an entire day to find a suitable location, a high mound in a melaleuca forest nearly a kilometer from Cal's farm. Here, they set up a secret, well-camouflaged observation post and began a surveillance operation that lasted for days and nights in extreme harsh conditions. The first few days of surveillance passed rather uneventfully. The reports sent back described a repetitive daily routine for Cal. He woke up very early, worked tirelessly all day, feeding the eels, checking the pond banks, and repairing machinery. He kept a pack of very aggressive sheepdogs. They constantly ran along the pond banks to guard the place, making close-range access impossible. The detectives also paid special attention to a large industrial machine located in a covered shed. From a distance, it looked like a feed grinder, the kind that farm owners often use. Cal operated this machine every day. The sound of the machine rumbled throughout the area, a monotonous and eerie sound. The first suspicious event occurred on the fifth afternoon of the surveillance. The river surveillance team reported seeing Cal paddle his boat across the river, heading toward the residential area where the victims disappeared. About 2 hours later, he returned, but this time there was another person in his boat. It was a man who looked disheveled and was walking unsteadily. The detectives quickly recognized the man as Leonard, another alcoholic who was also on the task force's list of high-risk individuals. The surveillance team was in a dilemma. They couldn't intervene without blowing the whole operation. They could only helplessly watch the boat dock, watching Leonard happily stumble along after Cal into the makeshift house, stepping into a deadly trap without knowing it. The faint electric light from the house stayed on till late at night. The surveillance team did not take their eyes off the target for a second. But then, nothing unusual happened. The lights went out, and the entire farm was plunged into silent darkness.
The next morning, the detectives strained their eyes, waiting. They waited to see if the man named Leonard would leave the farm. But a day passed, then 2, then 3. They only saw Cal continue his daily routine alone. He still fed the eels and operated the noisy grinder. No one else left the property, either by river or by land. Leonard had vanished, just like the 12 victims before him. He had entered the farm, but never left. This report, sent back to the command center, caused a shockwave. The task force had almost witnessed another disappearance taking place right on the main suspect's property. All suspicion against Calvin Fisher had now reached its peak. It was almost certain that he was the killer. His eel farm was a deadly trap, an isolated area where he could act without anyone knowing. However, Lieutenant Peterson knew that what they had was still not enough. Leonard entering the farm and not being seen leaving was still just circumstantial evidence. They had no bodies, no direct witnesses, no murder weapon. If they rushed to execute a search and arrest warrant now, with his cunning, River Eel Cal could very well deny everything. And a search of a property spanning dozens of acres might not yield results if they didn't know where to look. They needed physical evidence, something undeniable. In the emergency task force meeting, the atmosphere was extremely heavy. They knew they were dealing with a real monster, and the most daring and horrifying investigative theory was put forward. If Cal had killed the victims, what did he do with the bodies? With such a large number of victims, burying them or throwing them into the river would be very easy to detect. And then the investigators remembered the image of the industrial feed grinder that the surveillance team had observed. Is it possible, a young detective hesitated, that he ground up the victims' bodies to feed to the eels? The entire room fell silent. The theory was beyond imagination, utterly inhumane, but it logically explained the complete disappearance of the bodies and the existence of the large grinder on a farm worked by only one person. If this theory was correct, the evidence of the crime was right there in the eels swimming in the ponds.
A very daring plan was hatched. The task force could not sneak in and steal eels. They had to have a legitimate reason to be at the farm and take samples for examination without arousing suspicion. They decided to use a perfect cover, a city interagency inspection team. Lieutenant Peterson looked at his colleagues. His face hardened. "We can't go in there as police officers. We have to go in as something else. An inspection team from the State Department of Agriculture on the grounds of a sudden disease outbreak. That's the only way for us to get what we need without alerting him." The plan was approved. It was a high-risk gamble. If Cal was suspicious and uncooperative, or if he saw through their cover, the entire operation could be a failure. But if they succeeded, the eels they brought back might hold the final answer to the horrifying series of disappearances that had sowed fear for a year. The confrontation with the butcher was about to begin. The plan to approach Calvin Fisher under the guise of an interagency inspection team was meticulously and thoroughly prepared by the task force. Even the smallest mistake could lead to failure and endanger the officers involved. Lieutenant Ryan Peterson, after careful consideration, decided to personally lead the inspection team, acting as the team leader. Accompanying him were two experienced criminal investigators with quick wits and, most importantly, a genuine officer from the city's environmental police. The presence of this officer was the key factor in ensuring the authenticity of the inspection. They prepared a fake but very sophisticated set of documents, a sudden inspection order with the red seal of the Department of Agriculture, fake IDs with clear photos and titles, along with all the necessary specialized sampling tools. Meanwhile, at a secret location a few miles from the farm, a fully armed SWAT team was in position, ready to respond at a moment's notice. The next morning, the inspection team's motorboat began cutting through the waves, heading straight for Cal's eel farm. They chose to approach by river, the most natural and direct route to such an isolated farm. When the boat was still a few dozen meters from the shore, a pack of nearly a dozen sheepdogs rushed out from the bushes, barking furiously, creating a chaotic and threatening sound. From the makeshift house, a tall, burly man stepped out. It was Calvin Fisher. He was shirtless, revealing a muscular body, tanned skin, and intricate tattoos on his back and arms. He stood with his arms akimbo at the water's edge, his eyes squinted as he watched the approaching boat, his gaze full of suspicion and hostility. "Where are you fellers going? This is private property. No trespassing," he yelled, his voice rough and raspy. The boat docked, and Lieutenant Peterson stepped forward, keeping a safe distance. "Hello, sir. We are the city's interagency inspection team. There are signs of a new type of eel disease outbreak in the city. Under the direction of the city government, we're conducting a sudden inspection of water quality and taking eel samples at all the major farms along this river for testing. We hope for your cooperation." Cal did not answer immediately. He stepped forward and snatched the folder from Lieutenant Peterson's hand, reading it over and over, his eyes scrutinizing as if trying to find a loophole. "Why no notice? My farm has always been managed properly. We've never had any disease outbreak." Just then, the real environmental police officer in the team spoke up. He began to rattle off a string of technical jargon. "Sir, this is a sudden inspection procedure to prevent the spread of disease. We need to quickly check the pH, dissolved oxygen, and ammonia levels in your pond water, and also need to catch a few of the weakest-looking eels in the stock to take tissue samples for pathogen analysis. The whole process will be very quick." The professionalism and confusing scientific terms seemed to shake Cal's suspicion. He couldn't argue about things he had no knowledge of. After a moment of hesitation, he reluctantly nodded. "All right, get it done quickly and leave. Don't disturb my eels." The inspection began, and the atmosphere was extremely tense. Calvin Fisher stood with his arms crossed, never taking his eyes off the team members for a second. His vicious dogs also continuously circled, growling. The detectives had to perform their sampling procedures professionally while remaining highly vigilant. They walked along the pond banks, pretending to use water quality testing equipment. Finally, they reached the most critical stage. One detective, in the role of a technician, skillfully used a large net to scoop up a few healthy-looking eels from one of the main ponds. "We need the largest, healthiest eels to check their resistance and potential pathogens." Cal frowned, seeming displeased, but had no reason to object. The eels, living evidence of an unimaginable crime, were placed into specialized containers.
After completing the sampling, Lieutenant Peterson politely thanked Cal for his cooperation. The inspection team quickly got on the boat and left the farm. When the boat had gone a good distance, disappearing behind a bend in the river, everyone could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The dangerous mission was a success. The valuable samples, including the eels, were brought back to the command center under strict security. That same night, they were sealed and transported by air to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The request for analysis was also very specific: to analyze the eel tissue and stomach contents for human DNA. The FBI laboratory plays a crucial role in assisting local law enforcement agencies in complex cases, especially when local labs lack the equipment or expertise to handle specialized evidence like this. Sending the samples to the FBI, which is a free service, was a strategic move, ensuring that the results would be reliable and could hold up in court. After 4 long, stressful days of waiting, a confidential telex was sent to the task force. Lieutenant Peterson's hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was the forensic report he had been waiting for. The report, with its cold scientific terms, confirmed an undeniable truth. The experts at the FBI Criminal Science Division had succeeded in analyzing, amplifying, and identifying the presence of human gene fragments in the samples sent to them. In simple terms, the eels at River Eel Cal's farm had eaten human flesh. But what was even shocking was the final note. The experts had cross-referenced the human DNA profiles obtained from the eel samples with the DNA profiles of the family of Mr. David Thompson, one of the missing victims. The results showed that some of the human DNA found had a blood relation to the victim's family. The most horrifying theory was proven true. Calvin Fisher had killed people, dismembered their bodies, and used the remains of his victims as food for his eels. An emergency arrest and search warrant for Cal and his entire farm was approved by the police chief immediately. At 4 a.m., when the thick darkness of the river region still blanketed everything, the operation began. Dozens of officers from the most elite units silently approached the farm from both river and land. As the first light of dawn began to appear, Lieutenant Peterson gave the order to storm the place. The main assault team rushed into the stilt house. Calvin Fisher, who was fast asleep, was suddenly awakened. He only managed to grab the large cleaver he kept by his bed to resist, but was immediately tackled and completely subdued by the SWAT officers. Immediately after the suspect was arrested, a comprehensive large-scale search was conducted. The first location to be searched was the shed containing the industrial feed grinder. This time, they completely dismantled the machine. What they found inside confirmed the most horrifying theories. Deep in the machine's crevices, gears, and spiral shafts were countless fragments of bone, hair, and dried human tissue. This machine was the tool used to dispose of the evidence of his crimes.